Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch, the show that gives you a ringside view of India's foreign relations and its diplomatic outreach. I'm your host, VIKAS SWARUP. The Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, paid a state visit to India from March 8 to 11 and held the first annual India-Australia Summit with Prime Minister Modi. And that will be the focus of this edition of our program. Ties between India and Australia have gathered considerable pace in recent years, following Prime Minister Narendra Modi's landmark visit to Australia in 2014, which was the first Indian prime ministerial visit to that country in nearly 3 decades. Since then, there have been regular, high-level visits from both sides. Last year alone, at least 18 ministerial-level exchanges took place between the two countries. This was Prime Minister Albanese's first official visit to India since assuming office in May last year, but his third official interaction with Prime Minister Modi. They both met once in Tokyo last year on the sidelines of the Quad Summit and more recently in Bali for the G20 Summit. The annual summit mechanism itself was established as an outcome of the second virtual summit between India and Australia that was held in March last year. The 3-day visit of Prime Minister Albanese covered everything from cricket to commerce to climate. It began in Ahmedabad on March 8, where Prime Minister Albanese attended an education event marking the establishment of campus of Australian universities at the Gift City in Gujarat. The two Prime Ministers also witnessed the opening day of the 4th and final Border-Gavaskar Test match at Ahmedabad. From Ahmedabad, Prime Minister Albanese flew to Mumbai to attend the India-Australia CEO Forum. He also visited the Western Naval Command headquarters and INS Vikrant, the first foreign leader to do so since the first indigenously built aircraft carrier was commissioned last September. The final leg of the visit was in New Delhi, where the two Prime Ministers held the first India-Australia annual summit, during which they discussed the entire range of bilateral relations as well as issues of regional and global importance. Four agreements were signed, providing for cooperation in areas of sports, innovation, audiovisual production and solar power. Both Prime Ministers expressed satisfaction at the rapid expansion of bilateral relations since the launch of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in 2020, which has deepened cooperation across a diverse range of areas, including political and strategic, defense and security, trade and investment, education and research, agriculture and water, cyber and space, mining and critical minerals, climate change and renewable energy, and mobility of people. The Prime Ministers welcomed sustained progress under the defense and security pillar and the operationalization of General Rawat Officers Exchange Program, under which the first batch of officers are participating currently in New Delhi. Australia will host Exercise Malabar in 2023 for the first time. The two leaders welcomed the entry into force of the landmark India-Australia Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement on 29 December 2022. Last year, bilateral trade was $31.17 billion and two-way investment is $33 billion. The two leaders welcomed continued progress under the India-Australia Energy Dialogue and the ongoing collaboration on solar photovoltaic and hydrogen. The Prime Ministers renewed their commitment to supporting an open, inclusive, stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific where sovereignty and territorial integrity are respected. They reiterated their commitment to strengthening cooperation through the Quad. The Prime Ministers expressed satisfaction at the deep and vibrant people-to-people ties between the two countries, which is energized by the 976,000 Australians of Indian descent, and agreed to further strengthen this special bond. To learn more about this summit and its important outcomes, I am joined by two distinguished guests. His Excellency Barry Robert O'Farrell is Australia's High Commissioner to India since May 2020. A former Australian politician, he was the 43rd Premier of New South Wales from 2011 to 2014. Ambassador NAVDEEP SURI is Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and served as India's Ambassador to Egypt, Australia and the UAE. A very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Ambassador Suri. Now, India has the practice of annual summits with a very few select group of countries. What does Australia's addition to this list mean?
Well, as you said, it is a very short list. And the fact that Australia is now in that list means that it is in the absolute top tier of India's strategic partnerships. It's also a reflection of a process that's been underway for a while. I mean, I remember when I was in Australia, we started the first 2+2 dialogue where at the senior official level, the defense secretary and the foreign secretary of the two countries would meet together. That got elevated to the ministerial level, which was very significant because, again, that's something which we have with very, very few countries, a ministerial 2+2, to take that holistic, coordinated view on defense and security policy. And now the annual summit. But let me say, it's not just that the two leaders will meet once a year. You also have membership of other very active groups, whether it's a Quad or the G20. And if you just look at this one year, 2023, where we've hosted Prime Minister Albanese for a bilateral visit. And I think our Prime Minister will certainly go for the Quad Summit later this year in Australia. And then Prime Minister Albanese will be back in India, hopefully for the G20 Summit. What these top-level interactions, these engagements do is they give the leaders the opportunity to review progress in the roadmap that they've enunciated, that they've carved out. And it certainly holds all the officials to account that we agreed in the last summit meeting on A, B, C, and D. What is the progress on that? So I think these summit-level interactions really play a crucial role in keeping that dynamic relationship on track.
High Commissioner, what were Prime Minister Albanese's expectations from this visit? And were they met?
Well, you've indicated that he was interested in advancing the trade and economic area, the defence and security, the education and research, and also climate and renewables. And as he said on the way out, there could not have been a more open, productive or welcoming visit that he's been part of. So I think it's all heading in the right direction. I think to pick up NAVDEEP's point is that the two Prime Ministers on 5 occasions had one-on-ones. And as we all know in any relationship, the more time you invest, as opposed, one-on-one as opposed to the bigger group, the better the relationship. So clearly this is not just, we talk about India, Australia being trusted partners. I think what we've seen after this visit is that we have two leaders who share many things in common, both a vision for the region and the world, a commitment to practical outcomes, not just talk. And I think that's been strengthened between Prime Ministers Albanese and Modi over this short visit.
Ambassador SURI, now why did Prime Minister Albanese start his visit from Ahmedabad? And is cricket diplomacy now a part of the diplomatic toolkit for both countries?
Well, because cricket has always been an integral part of the conversation between India and Australia. But let me say, there was a time when our conversation used to be dominated by cricket cuisine and culture. And it used to annoy diplomats like us who wanted to get more done. Today, that conversation has moved to critical minerals, to cybersecurity, and of course to China. So, the dimensions of the conversation today have really evolved with the times and with our requirements. And while cricket remains a part of the conversation, I'm really pleased that we are now talking about much more serious, immediate stuff that matters to both countries. As far as Ahmedabad is concerned, I think this is not the first time that we've hosted a visiting dignitary in Ahmedabad. If I recall, President Trump had been hosted in Ahmedabad. Xi Jinping had also visited Ahmedabad. I think the reason is, one, Gujarat is one of India's most dynamic states. Ahmedabad is a bit of a showcase. The Prime Minister is personally very attached with his home state and the city. And it has not only a vibrant economy, but a very vibrant culture, as we saw in those holy celebrations, the festivities. It was dynamic, it was colorful, it was designed to impress. It makes an impact on the visitor, so why not?
Absolutely. Now, High Commissioner, Australia has a strong fit with the Indian efforts to modernize its higher education sector, particularly under the new education policy. Now, Deakin University of Australia has just set up a campus in Gujarat's Gift City. Do you think more Australian universities are going to follow?
Absolutely, and I'm surprised at the speed with which Australian universities are taking up the opportunities that exist under the National Education Policy. So Deakin University is the first foreign university to set up a branch campus at Gift City. It will be followed in the not too distant future by Wollongong University, whose global brand ambassador is cricketer Adam Gilchrist, which just demonstrates the importance of cricket diplomacy in getting things done. But I think for a country like Australia, where education has been a central pillar in the relationship between both of our two countries, providing young Indians with an alternative for those who can't or are unable to travel to Australia for education, they'll now be able to study here in India at Australian institutions. And clearly that's of benefit to this country. It continues to be a benefit to my country. And it reflects the increased closeness between Minister Clare, who was here 2 weeks ago, with 11 Vice-Chancellors looking at the opportunities in India, and your Education Minister, Mr Pradhan, but more importantly, the significant national education policy that's creating these opportunities.
Ambassador Suri, now the India-Australia Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement has just entered into force. The two countries are now working towards firming up the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, or CECA, by the end of this year. Why is it needed? And is it really doable?
So first, let's look at the achievement of getting the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement done. I think it reflected a paradigm shift in our thinking. We spent years, and I remember painful years, trying to negotiate a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement. And we didn't succeed because when we were trying to do all things, then the focus of the negotiations shifted on the areas of differences. And those were fairly complicated, whether it was our desire to protect our vulnerable agricultural sector or the dairy sector or others. The paradigm shift to the ECTA allowed us to focus on areas of agreement rather than disagreement. It allowed us to harvest the low-hanging fruit. And now that we've gotten that done and are actually beginning to make progress in implementation of that, we have the luxury now to start thinking about the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement. I think the important thing also that happens is we've gotten used to working with each other. Today, the ministers and the officials at our Department of Commerce and at DFAT in Australia engage with each other so regularly that a degree of confidence and goodwill has been built up, which makes it easier to resolve some of the more intractable issues that inevitably will have to be dealt with when we focus on the SIGA. But I think the combination of getting to know each other and political will that is manifest on the both sides is going to be an important boost. Why is it needed? My own view, and Barry may have a different perspective on that perhaps, is Australian business has been fairly shy of investing in India. I think this is one of those few relationships where the government-to-government relationship has actually been more visionary, far-sighted and nimble as compared to business. In sections of Australian business, India is still seen as too hard, too complex, too difficult. And I think what SIGA will do, as to an extent ECTA has done, is provide a major psychological boost that India is now open for business, the fact that we've done this trade agreement, and perhaps it will not only unlock the potential of some of the big Australian companies that came with Prime Minister Albanese on this visit, but also perhaps the Australian super funds, which are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars in assets, and which could find a very lucrative investment into India.
High Commissioner, you want to comment on this?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the fact that the Prime Minister visited India with 25 CEOs of senior and large Australian businesses demonstrates that that is changing. And as we saw with COVID, once change starts, it starts to also increase. So I think NAVDEEP is absolutely correct that for too long, the defence relationship, the G2G relationship was much stronger than B2B, but I think B2B is quickly catching up.
Now, Australia has reserves of 21 of the 49 minerals identified in India's critical mineral strategy. So how is bilateral cooperation proceeding in this very important sector?
Incredibly well, and I think that statistic highlights again why I'm so optimistic about getting a closer economic cooperation agreement, and that is that we have complementary economies. We have things that India needs to build its economy, and we have things that we can get from India to assist us. And critical minerals is a great example. And it's not a coincidence that Prime Minister Albanese came with his Minister for Resources, Madeleine King. She met with Minister Joshi, her opposite number. Kabul and the Australian Critical Minerals Office are looking to cooperate, and 5 projects, 2 lithium and 3 cobalt, have been identified for Indian investment to provide India with that secure supply chain that we know post-COVID is required, but importantly, we know is essential for India's tech industry, renewables industry, economy, just as much as it's critical to our economy.
Now, defence was also a very important component of this visit, as we saw with the visit to INS Vikrant and Western Naval Headquarters. How do you see the future of defence cooperation between India and Australia? Defence
cooperation has always been much more constant. When politicians wavered, when Quads were falling apart, the defence relationship was still strong because chiefs of Army, Navy, Air Force, chiefs of defence were always much better at their constancy of contact, constancy of commitment. And we've only seen that increase. Last year, each of the chiefs of our defence forces, plus the Chief of Defence Forces, came to India. Chief of Navy was here last weekend. That is happening in the opposite direction as well. We're seeing more complex exercises going on. We're seeing greater involvement. We're seeing P-18 submarine serials out of Goa and out of Darwin. Where our Defence Minister flew from Goa in a P-18 all the way to Delhi during his visit last year. So the defence relationship is strong, but it has to be given the growing strategic complexity in this region. And of course, it complements the work we do with ASEAN and also the Quad.
Ambassador Suri, now both Prime Ministers called for a stable, open, inclusive and prosperous Indo-Pacific, a region where Chinese assertiveness remains a source of anxiety for many countries. How do you see India-Australia cooperation in the maritime domain?
Well, when you look at the Indo-Pacific, it's a very vast place. In these tens of thousands of kilometers of water, what is critical is sharing information and intelligence. And I think this is critical to our maritime security, to our shared objective of keeping the sea lanes open for navigation to all. What we've built over the last few years is the architecture for maritime domain awareness. I remember when I was in Canberra, we signed a white shipping agreement which enables both countries to share pretty much real-time information on movement of ships. If you combine that with our plans to build a major naval base in Great Nicobar, almost sitting astride the Malacca Straits, if you look at Australia's vantage point in the Coco Islands and their ability to keep a watch on submarine traffic and any hostile activity, you can see the building blocks being put into place today. Add to those building blocks the Malabar exercises, where it's almost like a Quad security exercise that is taking place. Australia used to be very keen to participate, and we used to be reluctant. But guess what? The Chinese have encouraged both of us that this is a good idea. And this year, for the first time, the Malabar exercise is being held in Australia.
Australia is hosting it, yes.
And being hosted in Perth, just the point which is closest to us in India. The third dimension, I think, which we've started to work on is looking in a joint way at the Pacific Islands nations. Because, we don't want the Solomon Islands example to be replicated in other places.
High Commissioner, Australia hosting the Malabar exercises for the first time, it's a big deal?
It is a big deal, and I think NAVDEEP's right that at various times in the past, I think many countries involved with the Quad have been equivocal about it. That has changed post-COVID, and I think the charge is being led, in a sense, by the relationship between India and Australia. And I think that, Australia recognises India's leadership within the region. We're keen to work with India on that sacred vision, as described by Prime Minister Modi, of that free, open and respectful sovereignty across the Indo-Pacific. Happily, we're seeing more activity from India in the Pacific. We seem to be working on our own strengths. Australia's doing more amongst the ASEAN nations, where India's equally active. Our foreign ministers made an extraordinary effort in the Pacific, and we're seeing that being matched to some extent by the activities of the External Affairs Minister of India, recognising where the weaknesses are and where the work needs to be done.
Now, High Commissioner, from India, Prime Minister Albanese left for the United States, where President Joe Biden hosted the Australian and the UK leaders to formalise the AUKUS Security Pact, where Australia, I believe, is the linchpin. What was the geopolitical environment or factors that led to the birth of AUKUS?
Well, the fact is, as we've seen, there's greater strategic competition in our region of the world than everywhere except one other part of Europe. And the assessment in Australia was that we needed to adjust our defence capability to ensure that we have the tools needed to preserve the safety and peacefulness we want in the region. And the decision 18 months ago was that we would move from what were effectively diesel submarines to nuclear submarines, not because of any particular excitement about nuclear power, but because we know they can be out of base for longer, they can be submerged for longer, they can be patrolling for longer, and that's what it's about. So from our perspective, AUKUS is a good decision. It's a good decision for the region because it increases the capability of all those countries, including India and ASEAN countries, who want to ensure that the region in which we live is free, open, secure, respects rules, and countries can make sovereign decisions without coercion.
Ambassador Suri, now Prime Minister Albanese expressed Australia's strong support for India's G20 presidency and in particular appreciated India's hosting the Voice of the Global South Summit. How do you see India and Australia working together in the G20 context?
Well, you know, there's a pretty rich menu of issues before the G20. Many of these directly impact the developing countries, whether we talk about the rising burden of debt, the need for finance to address climate adaptation and mitigation or loss and damage, the need for technologies that will help us build disaster-resilient infrastructure as we see the effects of climate change getting more and more extreme around us. The developing countries, quite a few of them, not only appreciated the fact that we hosted the Voice of the South Summit, they would like India to be a voice of the South in real terms. And I think if India can use the platform of G20 to work with partners like Australia and several of the other major economies and thrash out some kind of a consensus on these difficult issues, we will be doing a real service for the interests of the South.
High Commissioner?
I just think the fact that India, a former developing country, is leading the economic recovery effort post-COVID is a good thing for us all, because it ensures that what's required is going to happen, which is a united worldview, not simply the views of a number of countries in the West or the developed countries that in the past have made most of the decisions.
Is climate finance, you think, one area where India and Australia, share the similar worldview?
Climate finance, renewables, climate change. I represent in India a government that's determined to deliver climate settlement in Australia that has sharpened up our focus on our targets for climate change and is working across the region to pursue that, because we all know this is an existential problem we're facing.
Now, High Commissioner, Prime Minister Modi conveyed to Prime Minister Albanese India's concern over recent incidents of attacks on temples in Australia and activities of some pro-Khalistani groups in Australia. How are the two countries tackling this needless irritant in bilateral ties? And how do you see the role of the Indian diaspora in Australia?
Well, the role of the diaspora, Indian diaspora in Australia, is overwhelmingly beneficial. They're active, they're productive, they are cooperative, they are supporting us everywhere. I've seen that in disasters, and we seem to have too many in Australia. Indians feeding volunteers, Indians pitching in to put out bushfires to recover from floods. And that makes what's happened over the last few weeks in Australia with the vandalism of temples all the more hard to take, because that is not the reputation that Indian migrants to Australia, Indian visitors to Australia have. But as Prime Minister Albanese said, whilst we believe strongly in freedom of speech in Australia, that does not give people the right to have violent protests, to engage in hate speech, or to vandalise places of worship, be they mosques, be they temples, be they churches or others. So Prime Minister Albanese made clear to Prime Minister Modi that we will be ensuring that our police and other security services take whatever steps are necessary to try and hunt down or to try and track down those who are responsible and try and avoid this happening again.
Ambassador NAVDEEP SURI, when you were ambassador to Australia, did you also face some issues with regard to the Indian community?
No, I didn't. And because I have a sense that there are external forces at work, because what you're seeing is a fairly coordinated offensive. You've seen it in the UK, you've seen it in Canada, you've seen it in Australia, you've seen the attempts to rekindle some of the problems in Punjab itself. So I think we should all be very mindful that, to me, as somebody who is from Punjab itself, I don't see this as organic. I see it as something that is being coordinated, pushed by forces that are hostile to us.
And VIKAS, can I just add
yes,
that
please.
As a former Chief Minister of an Australian state, I never had anything come across my desk that suggested that Indians were not doing other than enjoying life in Australia and being productive. But of course, this so-called Khalistani referenda has no legal standing in Australia, no legal standing here. Australia respects India's sovereignty. I tend to agree with the comments of the illustrious former High Commissioner to Australia in terms of what it's all about.
Well, on that note, we must bring this discussion to a close. Thank you very much, High Commissioner O'Farrell, Ambassador Suri. Few of India's bilateral relations have transformed as rapidly in the past few years as that with Australia. The same can be said of India's place in Australia's foreign policy. Both countries are united by shared values and converging interests. The visit of Prime Minister Albanese and the first annual summit have greatly advanced India-Australia cooperation and are set to take bilateral ties to the next level. That is all I have for you in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Thank you for watching. Till we meet again next week, take care and goodbye.